What human activities have caused present-day climate change? Dave Borlace, in a recent Just Have a Think video, looked at two new papers investigating that question. I think he did a good job describing our papers, but some people were disturbed by the idea that agriculture has caused more warming than fossil fuels. Some of Dave's subscribers reacted so strongly that he put out a second video a week later and labelled the work controversial. This video is a response to critics of the papers. Some of it is quite technical, but I hope understandable. So what has caused present-day climate change? Strap in, it's an interesting story and science discovery at work through vigorous debate. The most controversial idea in the papers was that we could count all carbon emissions consistently. How could that be controversial, I hear you say? Because it's unconventional. It conflicts with greenhouse accounting conventions decided 30 years ago. So let's start with the process. What happens when we emit carbon? And when I say carbon, that's carbon dioxide when it's in the air. So here's the process. When we burn fossil fuels, about a third of the carbon emitted ends up in the atmosphere, and 2/3 is drawn down by growing vegetation, not cycled but stored. When we clear and burn a forest, the same thing happens. A third goes to the atmosphere and 2/3 is stored by vegetation. But the rules, the conventions, were decided differently. The entire fossil fuel emission is counted, that's gross accounting. But when it comes to land clearing, only the airborne part is counted, that's net accounting. You might think that's inconsistent, and we thought so too, because all carbon emissions behave the same way, most stored and part in the atmosphere. So why would we count them differently? Well, there are several reasons, so let's dive in. Firstly, warming comes from gas in the atmosphere. So for land clearing, they decided the airborne part is what should be counted, and fair enough. But what about fossil fuels? What's different? Fossil fuel carbon was seen as new carbon, additional to the existing biosphere carbon cycle, with the extra carbon causing warming. Sounds plausible? Certainly, fossil fuels add new carbon to the atmosphere, but we humans have cleared half the original 6 trillion trees on Earth, so the carbon stored in those trees is also new carbon to the atmosphere, just like fossil carbon. So the new carbon argument becomes less valid. But there are other arguments for treating them differently. Right now, the atmosphere contains mostly fossil carbon. Is that a smoking gun incriminating fossil fuels? This is the interesting part. We've been cutting down forests for about 10,000 years and burning fossil fuels for about 6,000 years. Up until about 1750, the biosphere, mainly forests, had been able to absorb the excess, so atmospheric carbon dioxide remained fairly stable, like a Goldilocks zone. So for 6,000 years, the proportion of fossil carbon in the biosphere carbon pool was growing as trees mopped up the excess. When you look at the graph, fossil fuel emissions overtook land clearing carbon back in the 60s. Then, if you look at the total emissions and total drawdown, we see that nature is only about 30 years behind in mopping up all carbon emissions. So the atmosphere is dominated by emissions from the last 30 years. Did you catch that? The biosphere and oceans store all emissions from all sources, but have been slipping behind and are now 30 years behind. Therefore, the carbon in trees cut down is a mix of original biosphere carbon with a growing proportion of fossil carbon, and has been so for thousands of years. In fact, forest growth in the last few decades contains mostly fossil carbon. Therefore, land clearing of that growth is releasing mostly fossil carbon. So now we should look at trees very differently, particularly the growth in the last few decades, because trees are mostly standing fossil carbon. I single out trees because forests hold 90% of the above ground carbon, and forests have doubled their carbon capacity due to CO2 fertilisation. Forests are the heavy lifters, and soil carbon moves but very slowly in comparison, mostly negative. So the carbon in play in recent woody growth and in the atmosphere is mostly fossil carbon. Therefore, this argument loses validity. But there's a further argument for treating emissions differently: slash and burn. Right now, all eyes are on the tropics, where 96% of the world's deforestation is occurring. Here, there are significant areas of slash and burn, shifting cultivation. Some argue that net accounting is justified here, because regrowth follows clearing. This also sounds plausible until we acknowledge that land clearing is certainly anthropogenic, human-caused, but regrowth occurs despite human intervention. We cannot claim responsibility for photosynthesis. That's the work of nature, not ours. But the idea of consistent gross accounting is not new science. Several experts in land emissions, deforestation, biodiversity loss have published multiple papers justifying consistent gross accounting of land emissions, because net accounting conceals the full emissions and drawdown. They reason that these are different processes that have different impacts over different timescales and require gross accounting to fully describe them. So looking at these papers, the use of gross accounting for all carbon emission sources is established science, but it certainly overturns convention. Another reason the paper was considered controversial was the use of effective radiative forcing, or ERF, to compare warming from different gases, rather than the conventional 100-year global warming potential comparison. Strangely, the criticism levelled at ERF was that it was an instantaneous measure of warming from each gas. This is curious because ERF values used in the study were accepted published IPCC values estimating the combined effect from 1750 on present-day warming. Time series emissions data used in the study cover the exact same period. The IPCC values showed that if we had used the conventional global warming potentials, that would have underestimated present-day warming from methane by a factor of 3. That's a lot. A more accurate comparison would be to assess emissions using different GWPs for each year, so that for a 2020 target, methane emitted in 1750 would be assessed with a 270-year GWP, and at the other extreme, 2019 emissions would be assessed using 1-year GWPs with different GWP values for each year in between. This is overly complex and demonstrates the limitations of using one time-dependent metric like GWP. ERF is state-of-the-art climate science. Its use is well established for sectors like aviation, which has varying emission lifetimes, like agriculture, but again, unconventional. Which brings us to the final point of contention, cooling emissions. This is also established science published by the IPCC in their latest assessment. If we want a comprehensive assessment, surely we must include all emissions, both heating and cooling. By the way, we also include cooling from land use change albedo, so that we're comprehensive. Most of the cooling aerosols come from fossil fuels, and their impact is strong, masking or preventing 3/4 of warming from fossil fuels. Of course, aerosols are very harmful to health, and there are programs to clean them up, but we can't ignore their impact on global warming. Also, as aerosols are cleaned up, we must also brace ourselves for further warming. The result of applying all three changes to conventional accounting is that fossil fuels have made a secondary contribution to present-day warming, about 18%, 1/8, due to strong cooling emissions. Methane rises in importance by a factor of 3, and extensive land uses, namely agriculture, rise dramatically due to land clearing emissions. We find agriculture to have caused 60% of present-day warming. So to wrap all of this up, these three accounting changes are not controversial. There is established science backing up all three. Ours was simply the first study to apply all three together. So it's not controversial, but it certainly is unconventional. We argue that our approach gives a more comprehensive, more transparent assessment of what human activities have caused present-day climate change. What do you think? Are the conventions serving us well? Should we explore novel approaches that may help guide us to better climate change decisions? This debate is getting interesting. Thank you.